Hey everyone, welcome back to part 9 of my React Redux and Webpack tutorial series. If you've been following along, your code base should be up to date, and if you're just starting out or want to make sure you have the right code, you can grab the code from my repo on GitHub and make sure you're at the branch part-9-start. So in my last video we set up Redux, and we currently, let me get the app up and running. We currently have a very simple to-do list where we can add to-dos. That's because we set up only one action, and that's to add a to-do. In this video, we'll set up some actions and some ways to delete to-dos and also to mark them as completed. Before we dive into that, there's a few little optimizations that we can make. If you've been following along and writing the code the same way I have, you'll notice that when you type something in, like another to-do, and hit enter, nothing happens. That's because in the code, this is in our to-do input, I've written the submit button to be just a button, and it's kind of being handled separately than the input. So one way that we can make this a little bit more robust is to create a form that will house both the input and the submit button. So instead of making this a button, we can make it an input of type submit, and then I think we have to give it text, maybe. I'm actually not sure about this. We'll figure it out. Get rid of this. This becomes an input. I think it needs text. This is just what the button is going to display. And then this onClick handler can actually be moved to the form, and it can be an onSubmit. And this allows the form to recognize the enter button when you're typing in the input and to submit it. We can move that over. So now we have the input here where we're typing in text, and we have a submit button here. Save that. How do you clear this crap? Cool, so the enter now works. I just hit enter on that one. Cool, so that's fixed. That's a little bit more of a robust way of doing that. So now let's start talking about how we want to add our delete and completion functionality. So we're definitely going to have to add actions. We're also going to have to add to our reducer to be able to handle both delete and completing the to-dos. The other thing we're going to have to do is on our to-do list here, we're mapping over our to-dos and we're returning a list item. This is great, except that we kind of want each of these to-dos to have a button for deleting and a button for completing, let's say. And so one thing we can do is we can start adding things here. So we can make this a multi-line return, and we can add buttons. But for me, this starts getting a little bit almost too much code here in this mapping function. So this mapping function is a little complicated. There's a lot of curly braces, there's a lot going on, and it's really nice if it can just be all on one line and return one thing. So this is a great example of a time where you'd want to maybe modularize your code a little bit, or should I say refactor. So instead of putting everything in to-do list, let's make another component called to-do item. And this is a component that is just represents one to-do item in our list. And so instead of returning a generic list item, we're going to return a to-do item. And then within that to-do item, we can have the text and we can have buttons and so on and so forth. So let's go ahead and do that. So for this, let's make our to-do item .js folder or file. I'm going to do what I've been doing and just copy and paste this stuff. Change it to to-do item. And so we're going to be changing this render function a bit. I think instead of an unordered list, it's actually going to be a list item. For now, let's just display the text. So let's go back. I'm not exactly sure how I named the prop, so let's go back to the to-do list component. We see that, well, we see we're still making a list item, so let's change that to to-do item. Let's import the to-do item. We're passing down just a key right now, and we actually don't need this kind of inner text aspect of it, so we actually get rid of that. Right now it's only getting a key, which is great. It still needs a key. If you'll recall from last time, I talked about how when you map over something and you return a variable number of JSX elements, React needs to be able to keep track of each specific one because because it's rendering multiple of these elements, and React needs to be able to know which ones change if you do specific things to specific elements. And so for that, you need to give it a unique key. So in this case, we're just giving the ID as the key. If you don't do this, you'll get a very descriptive error from React, and it'll tell you that every component in an array that you're rendering needs to have a unique key. And so we want access to the actual to-do, so let's do that. And remember, the map function is mapping over each to-do in the array, and it's passing in each to-do as to-do. So that's how we just have to-do here, instead of like this.props or something like that. So now we're giving to-do item the prop of to-do, so we can go in here. This.props, each one's getting the to-do, and each to-do has a text. So right now we're just displaying the text. Let's save this and save the list. Getting an error here. I didn't close that right there. Need to close the JSX element there. So everything is saved. Let's head back. Cool, so everything is looking good. Still works. So let's make our to-do item have a little bit more functionality than just the text. So we can make the text a div. Under this div, we'll have a button that will say mark as completed. And then we'll have another one that is delete to do. Cool. So each of these buttons is going to have a handler. So this on-click handler is going to be, let's call it handle complete. We'll bind this. And then this one is going to be very similar, but this will be handle delete. Cool. So we have handle complete is a function, and we also have handle delete. Cool. So we're kind of all set up on the client side to be ready to start plugging into Redux and handling some of these actions that we want to complete. So I think this is a great time. Actually, first, let's just make sure we have these buttons in there. They're actually on the page. Well, I guess I checked that last one. Wasn't actually running the new code. So start your server again. Refresh the page. Cool. We've got a couple buttons to help us out. And we're able to add our to-do. So everything is looking good. Cool. So I think this is a great time to start adding some of our Redux components to handle completion and deletion events. So let's just add our actions. This is probably, I don't know, there's no right way on where to start where to start adding stuff. So let's go complete to do. This is a function that we'll leave the input here blank. We want to return the type being complete to do. Again, this is just the name of the action. It's what makes it, it's what allows our reducers to know what to do. And what kind of payload do we need? Well, we're going to need to know which to-do we actually want to mark as deleted or as completed. So one thing that we might want to recall is that each of our to-do, I'm going to the reducer now. Each of our to-dos, when we add it, is getting a unique ID. We have this little helper function to find the current maximum ID, and then we're giving it its unique ID. We're adding one. So every to-do, even on the client, has an ID associated with it. And it's this ID we can use to allow the reducer to, when it has an action of complete or delete, to know which to-do to complete or delete. So when we do call complete to do, it's going to have an ID. We're going to pass it in the ID, and then that's what we're going to give here. That's going to be our payload. We're going to have an ID, and the reducer is going to know what to do with that ID. I'm getting an error here because I don't have a comma. Let's add delete to do. And in a much the same way, what we need to know is which to do to delete. So we're going to pass it in an ID. This is going to be delete to do. And again, it's going to have an ID. Cool, so our actions are set up. That looks pretty good. Now that our actions are set up, let's add our cases to our reducer. So we have the case of complete to do. And we have our case delete to do. Cool, and let's fill these in now. Before I forget, because I forgot in the last video, we need return statements. Cool, so again, the one requirement of a reducer is that it's a pure function and returns a new state. So as we saw in the last video, object.assign and passing in an empty object as the first input is a really great way to do this. So let's start setting that up. And then you can pass in the state, so it'll copy all the properties into this new object. And so what we can do is we can basically map over all of the to-dos. So we can make a new to-dos property. It's going to have an array similar to what we're doing here. But instead of just adding one and then adding the rest, we're going to map over them. And if the ID that we have from our action, so the ID that we want to mark is completed, if that if that is equal to, if the ID of the current to-do we're mapping over is equal to the ID that we want to perform the action on, then what we're going to do is we're going to mark that to-do as completed, or we're going to toggle its completed property on or off. And for every other to-do, as we're mapping over, they are not going to be equal to our ID that's coming from our action. And so for that, we'll just return the to-do itself. So let's start doing that. So I'm making a new object here because object.assign takes objects, and then we'll go through their properties and copy them over. So this object is going to be our to-dos is going to have our to-dos property, which is what we want to update. And here's where we actually perform our map over each of these to-dos. Cool. So again, map needs to return the new value that it wants to put into the array. And so we can do a ternary operation here. So we can say if the current ID of the to-do that we're mapping over, if it's equal to the action.id, and remember, we created the action, and every action for a complete to-do is going to have the ID. So if it's the to-do that we want to change the completion on, this is the ternary syntax. So we're evaluating this, and then if it's true, we evaluate the first thing after the question mark, and if it's false, it'll be the thing then after that, separated by a colon. So here we want to do we want to perform the action of updating this to do with the new completed property. So if it's true, we want to make it false. If it's false, we want to make it true. And remember, we don't want to mutate state. We have access to state, and we can do things with it, like loop over it and return a new array. But even here, with this specific to-do, we don't want to say to-do.completed equals, to-do, like the opposite of to-do.completed or something like that, because we'd actually be modifying the completed property on this to-do. So instead, we can do a very similar thing with object.assign, pass in the empty object, allow it to copy all of the properties of the to-do. Then we give it yet another object with the property we're really interested about, which is completed. And this property, we are going to reference the current to-do.completed and make it the opposite of it. Negate it to be the opposite. So this is getting to be a pretty long line. We can drop this to the next line. And then I said, so this is going to happen, and it's going to return our new to-do with the updated completed. But I mentioned that this only happens when the IDs match, but for every other to-do, all we want to do is return the current to-do. So that's the second option of the ternary operator. Cool, so this should work. Yeah, so let's, while we're here, let's just write the delete to do. It's actually going to be pretty similar to the complete to do. And then we'll go around and hook it up to the actual client so that those buttons can actually do their jobs. So this is going to return an object.assign state. and then another object with the to-dos property that we want to update. And here we're going to loop over our state.todos, but instead of doing a map, since we never need to return something new, we can use a very similar helper method called filter. And what filter does is it takes in a function and it returns, you want to return true or false depending on whether you want to keep that to do in the array. So this is great for deleting because basically we want to return true for every to-do unless the ID of the to-do is the same as the action.id, as the ID we want to delete. So what we can do here is we can just return to-do.id is not equal to action.id. So when it's not equal to action, it's going to be true. So we're going to return true, and we're going to keep that to-do in the array that we're going to make as the property, set as the property of to-dos. On the other hand, when the to-dos do equal, this will actually be false there because we're saying, is it not equal? So no, it's not equal. They're equal. So it'll be false, and it won't include it in this new array. And then, therefore, it'll be deleted. So let's save that. And now let's head back to our to-do items. So we set up these handlers to handle complete and handle delete. And if you'll recall from our last video, we need to have access to this .props.dispatch. Dispatch comes from the store, and we've connected our app component with our connect function. And so if we head to the browser and we head to our React Dev Tools, let's let these load up. You can see that our app component has a prop of dispatch. That's how we connect dispatch into action. We've sent it down. We've sent dispatch down as a prop to to-do input, and that's because we needed the submit button of the to-do input to be able to handle an action or to fire off an action. We also need that to happen on every to-do item. So we actually need to pass the dispatch down into to-do list, and then to-do list will also have to pass it down into each to-do item. So let's do that right now. So in our app, we need dispatch to be there as well. And then in to-do list, this guy needs a dispatch. Cool, so if we save that, let's refresh. We see that our to-do list has dispatch and our to-do item has dispatch. Cool. So we're ready to go ahead and reference this props.dispatch in our to-do item class, component. So let's do handle complete first, since that's what we've been doing first each time. So this props.dispatch, we're going to have access to our actions, so we're going to have to import them, but it's going to be actions.complete to do. And remember, complete to do needs the ID of the to do that we're trying to toggle. So this is going to be this .props.todo, since this component is getting a prop like we have here with the .text, but it'll be .id. Simple as that. Let's go ahead and copy that line. And let's make this delete instead of complete. And again, it'll get the to-do.id. And we need the actions, so import actions from, we're going up into Redux, into actions. Save that. Cool, so On this initial to-do for demo purposes, I push this button, mark as completed. Let's go down to our logs here, and we'll see that we have an action called complete to-do. Our previous state was a to-dos property, which was an array with one object, and completed was false. We had an action of complete to-do on ID of 0, which matches the ID here. And let's check our next state. It's a to-dos array with one object, but completed is true. So we did successfully toggle the completion there. And in a future video, we will start to work with how we can use style, and we can see that happen a little bit better. But I think we might be able to see it happen a little better on to-do to be deleted. So let's add that. We've added the to-do. Our array now has is a length of 2. If we hit delete, it goes away. We fired the action delete to-do, and it removed the correct to-do from the list. We can delete that one. We can add more, and we can delete them. Cool. So that's great. We've now successfully set up all the actions that we really want to go on in our app. So we can add a to-do, we can mark it as completed, and we can delete it from the list. So I think there's one kind of trick that I want to show you guys, and that is that if you'll notice when we were writing our code and we were passing the dispatch down, first of all, it was a little annoying to have to pass the dispatcher down each time to each component. This isn't so much of an issue, and it's actually, this is part of building apps with React. You have to kind of always make sure you're passing things down. The great thing about React is there's not this spaghetti code of arrows, so it's very easy to understand what is getting passed down to any given component. The issue with passing the dispatcher down is that then in each component where you want to dispatch an action, so here's our to-do input, we had to go ahead and we had to import our actions. And then in to-do item, we had to import our actions. And then in, well, yeah, we didn't have to here. But it becomes kind of repetitive, and it's kind of going against this whole don't repeat yourself type thing. So there's a little bit of a trick, not a trick, but we can kind of reduce some of this extra code that we keep writing. And we can do that using some Redux tools from their library. So in much the same way that we connected our app and mapped state to props, well, we can also map the dispatcher to props. And this allows us to set up a little bit, we can remove some of this extra code dealing with the dispatcher and just worry about actions. And then we can set up our actions to be imported here in app only once, and then we can worry about sending specific actions down as opposed to sending the dispatcher down and then in each specific component importing actions. Let's see how we do that. Basically, instead of just having one input here to the connect function, we also are going to make, we're going to give it a second parameter called map dispatch to props. And so let's add that function. And what this does is Redux is going to, just like it passes in state into this function that you give it, it's going to pass in dispatch to the second function you give it. Now that we have access to this dispatch here in this function, what we can do is we can return an object. Up here we were returning an object as well. We didn't map it, we didn't return any specific part of state because it was so simple, we just returned state itself. But here we can actually return a specific properties that we want to have available to app, because right now all it has is dispatch. We would like it to have an actions property. So this way we only import our actions once, and then we don't have to worry about dispatch. And the other cool thing that Redux has is a method called bindActionCreators. action creators. And what you pass into action creators is your actions and the dispatch. Remember, we have access to the dispatch here. What this does is it allows you to not have to call, let's go to to-do input and go to our handle submit. You don't have to call dispatch and pass in an action. You just have to call and invoke the action itself. What bindActionCreators does is just wraps all of your actions with the dispatcher and returns them. They're named the same thing, so we'll have actions.add to do, actions.complete to do, actions.delete to do, and they're just wrapped around with the dispatcher. And so you don't have to pass down dispatcher, and you don't have to dispatch the actions explicitly. When you call the action, because they're wrapped with the dispatcher, they're kind of these modified actions, and they'll just dispatch themselves, basically. So let's just stop talking and see how that works. This comes from, I think, the React Redux library. Just Redux. So we're going to import bindActionCreators from Redux. Cool. So let's see what happened here. Refresh our app. Something went wrong. Actions is not defined. App, line 27. Ah, yes. So remember, I kept having to import actions in all those individual components, but I said doing this helps us just import it into one place. So let's do that. Actions from up one Redux actions. Cool. Refresh our app. Let's check out what our app component has now. It doesn't have a dispatcher anymore. It only has actions. And these actions are, you can't really see them here, but they're wrapped with the dispatcher. So now we can, instead of passing down the dispatcher and importing your actions, you can just pass down your actions, and then when you call them, you just call the actions. You don't have to call them with the dispatcher. So it kind of helps simplify code. In a way, it also adds a little bit level of complexity, but I hope that my explanation showed you that really it's just wrapping your actions with the dispatcher. I found it's easier to do it this way, and I found it means you have to write a little bit less repeated code. So let's see how we can fix some of this stuff. So our to-do input only needs to know, what do we need to do in to-do input? We need to dispatch the add to-do action. So instead of passing down a dispatcher, let's pass down add to-do. And this is going to be this.props.actions.add to do. Now in our to-do input, we don't have to import our actions because we're getting the action and it's already wrapped in our dispatcher. So we don't even have to do this. We just have add to do like that. So save everything. Let's see, it's up to date. New to do, and it worked. Cool. So let's do the same thing with to-do list. Ultimately, to-do list needs to pass down things, the actions to to-do item, and to-do item needs complete and delete to do. Now this is 2/3 of our actions, so for me, what I would do is I would just make a prop called actions, and I would send down our actions, and then in to-do list, I'd probably do the same thing, just actions. And then in to-do item, we don't have to dispatch it, and we can just call it with, we're sending down actions, and then we want delete to do. And here we want complete to do. Save that. App is up to date. Delete. delete. And I'm just going to assume completed worked as well. Cool. So let's see. I think we've basically done everything that I wanted to get done in this video. We've learned how to add multiple Redux actions, and we've learned how to use the bindActionCreators to wrap our actions in dispatcher. And then instead of having dispatch as a property that we pass down, we just have our dispatch wrapped actions. We can then pass those down to the specific components we need. We can pass down specific action creators or just the action creators themselves. And this means that we don't need to import our actions up here, and even here I can get rid of that. Cool. And so we have our app is up and running. We can delete them and we can mark as completed. And right now the only way we can see that is by checking out the state, and we can change the completed to true. Cool. So that's it for this one. I think in the next video we're going to learn a little bit about how to style your application using React. There's a lot that you can do, and I don't think there are any best practices, but we'll see a bunch of different ways. I'll show you a little bit how I do it, and then I think in a following video after that we'll learn a little bit about how to set up a production environment with a Webpack and your styling and what have you. So I hope you enjoyed this one, and I'll see you for the next one.